Yeah, for sure. I'll be done before you get back.
Right, see you in a bit.
See you in a bit, dude. Hey guys, Chris from Average Eskate Reviews here, and I'm back with another video. Not so much of a big gap like last time, and this time we're going to be looking at the Evolve GTR Carbon versus the Evolve GTR Bamboo. Heavily requested video. I'm going to be talking you through the differences between these boards. Now, as always, I'm going to be splitting my video into categories. Now, the categories I want to go through with this board is essentially going to be the ride, the deck, which also kind of impacts on the materials that both of these boards are constructed from, and then a summary with a couple of points that don't really fit into the categories that I've explained previously, but are more differences between these two boards. Before we get into the video, please consider hitting the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with all of the videos that I post. It'd be greatly appreciated, and a big thank you for the support I've had so far, because we're now over 1,000 subscribers and we intend to keep posting more videos. Without further ado, let's jump into it and tell you the differences between these two boards. So the first point I'm going to be touching on is going to be the feel of these two boards. When we look at the Carbon versus the Bamboo, one of the big elements that you're going to really feel is the stability versus the flex. Now, either of them isn't bad, not one is better than the other. It's complete personal preference. But obviously, this being my day-to-day rider at the moment, switching from a flexible deck to a stiff deck, just standing on the board, you feel it immediately. There's no flex, no give. The structure of the board is just completely stiff. So what this means is that when you are absolutely hammering it down a road, top speed, especially if you've got bigger wheels on the board, but I have to mention that anything we talk about in this video is going to be in reference to the 97 street wheels. That's what we tested both of these boards out on, so please bear that in mind when you hear my feedback. But when you're going full speed on the board, when you're using the Carbon deck, which is the Carbon GTR over here, you really feel planted, you feel stable, it feels like you have a really good sense of the road. Now, when you do the exact same thing, top speed in the Bamboo board, it's not so much that it's a bad feeling or not as good as a feeling, it's just a completely different feeling. You have that flex, you have that bounce, which has always been my preferred style of deck when I'm using a board. I prefer to have that flex, that bounce, but I've definitely got to mention that it felt great hitting top speeds in the Carbon because it was just so stable versus being in the Bamboo, which has a little play, has a little give in the deck while you're riding. So when you're going over bumps or hills, you're kind of flexing and bouncing around, not in a bad way. It's just how the board has been designed. It feels great. But if your sole intention is to be as stable as you can while you're absolutely flying down a road, then this is definitely going to be the type of board that would exceed in that particular department. So you're probably sitting there wondering, so where does the flex win? Where does the flex really benefit you? If you still want to be able to hit top speeds, nothing's stopping you from doing that, and it still does feel great in the Bamboo. It just feels different and more stable in the Carbon. But I still do love the way this board feels, especially when you are carving at speed. That's definitely something that the Carbon can't do that the Bamboo does very, very well. When you're carving at high speeds or even low speeds, having the flex of that deck feels insane. The way the deck flexes, gives, and then snaps back into place is a feeling that's really, really difficult to describe, and it's not something that the carbon can do. So it's really a case of what type of rider that you are. If you're the type of rider that wants stability, that wants speed, with also some carving as well, this is definitely going to be the one that you need to consider. But if you're the type of rider that's looking for that flex, that give in the deck, that snap back, getting really deep and leaning into your calves, still being able to hit top speed, still feeling great, this is going to be the one that you need to go for. But saying that, your build, your weight does make a massive difference on which board you want to get. If you're a very big, very built skater, I'll have some links down below to Evolve's suggested weight for if you want to pick up this board or if you want to pick up this board. But rule of thumb is if you're very big, very built, very heavy, bamboo is not going to be the one that you want to go for because of the flexiness of the deck. You're going to want to consider going for the carbon. But I'll put all of those links in the description down below so you can click and see what Evolve suggest based on your weight, which deck you should go for. But the overall feel of riding both of these boards, the way that the deck reacts on the bamboo, the way it leans, the way it flexes and then snaps back while you're carving, while you're going around bends, corners, it feels great. Top speed, you're getting a little give, which if your sole intention is to go as fast as you can and you want a very stable deck, maybe that's where this one isn't so perfect, but it's still fantastic at being able to go top speed. But this one really excels in the carving department, whereas the carbon over here excels in the speed and stability department. So it's just a case of weighing up which one of these two options is best suited for your style of skating. From there, we're going to be moving on to the deck and the way that both of these two decks have been constructed. So starting off with the carbon deck, of course, carbon fiber, the way that this deck has been designed is that there is a cutout or a groove inside the center of the deck where the battery sits and is integrated into the construction of the board itself. So when you look at the base of the board, there's no battery attached, it's completely smooth carbon fiber, there's no notches, ridges, gaps, or anything like that. Now, when we look at the way that the bamboo has been constructed, it's a bamboo and fiberglass deck, very, very strong, snaps back into place really well when it flexes and feels great under your feet. But with this deck being a bamboo deck, the battery is then attached onto the bottom of the board. Now, where this has a lot of differences in terms of the way it feels when you're riding is that, first and foremost, the battery on the bamboo sits much closer to the ground than what you would see in the carbon. In other words, the carbon is thinner than the bamboo itself. Roughly, you're looking at about 40 millimeters in thickness of the actual deck and the battery versus roughly 60 millimeters of thickness based on the measurements that we've had. To put that into perspective, I'm just under 80 kilograms, roughly 75, 76 kilograms. And when I stand on the bamboo board, I have 50 millimeters of clearance between the battery and the ground. This is just with my weight on the board. No flex, no bouncing. When you're riding, the board is flexing, you're going to have even less clearance. Now, when we look at the carbon board, with me standing on the board, I have 80 millimeters of clearance between the bottom of the board or the bottom of the deck and the ground itself. Because this deck doesn't flex, you can pretty much expect to have 80 millimeters of clearance while you're riding around. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you're riding about and you're going over, I don't necessarily drop down off of curbs, that's something I've never done on boards like these, but when you go over speed bumps or anything like that, if you flex the board or if you're going quite fast and there's a bit of flex and give as the board goes over the speed bump, with the bamboo, the battery is going to come into contact with the speed bump. This is something that's happened on numerous occasions, and to be honest, it's something that I didn't really expect to happen. But with the carbon, this has never happened. Doesn't matter how fast I've gone over a speed bump, the bottom of the board has never come into contact with anything that I'm riding over, which has been great. So this again comes into question of when you're looking at the type of build that you are, where you're going to be riding, that might help you in hopefully figuring out which one of these two boards is going to be the best one. But saying that, I have to mention that I've not caused any damage to my board. There's a few very, very light cosmetical scratches to the bottom of the bamboo's battery. And remember, that's the battery housing, not the actual battery itself. The board's completely fine, but it's annoying when you do hear that scrape when you're going fairly slowly and you go over a speed bump. It's something that you don't really expect, so definitely food for thought. From there, when we look at the sealing of both of these two boards have been thoroughly tested by Evolve and they're both weather sealed. But because they are two different decks, carbon versus bamboo, the way that they've been sealed is different. Now, saying that, it's not saying that one is technically much better than the other, it's just a different type of sealing. For example, the bottom of the GTR Carbon, as I said previously, has no grooves, no gaps, no spacing. Everything is built into the actual body of the carbon fiber. How you get into the battery on the Carbon is from the top of the deck, whereas when we look at the battery on the Bamboo board, again, the screws are on the top of the board, but the battery itself has gaps in between to allow the deck to be able to flex. If it was one solid piece of battery and the housing was just one solid casing, the board wouldn't be able to flex anywhere near as well as it does. And also saying that if you look at the bottom of the Bamboo board, it also has USB ports on the bottom of it, which again, when you're thinking about weather sealing and waterproofing, is definitely something to consider. But as I said, both of these boards have been tested thoroughly by Evolve, but it's just important to mention those couple of points and keep that in mind. Now, touching on some more points about the decks of each of these boards, looking at the Bamboo, it features quite a deep concave, which is really, really nice for carving. You feel really planted as the board and deck are kind of like swinging side to side while you're really getting deep into your turns. It feels great for that type of stuff. And in terms of the dimensions of the Bamboo's deck versus the GTR Carbon, the Bamboo is actually roughly 2 inches shorter than the Carbon deck. But aside from that, when we look at the thickness or the width of this deck, it's about 5 millimeters wider. Now, when you're standing on it, it doesn't actually feel like it's wider. It definitely feels a little bit shorter, but because of the concave, it doesn't actually feel wider because of how your feet are positioned inside it. This is my personal take or my personal preference. Now, when we look at the way that the Carbon deck feels, you definitely do notice the extra 2 inches of length. And the deck itself is much, much flatter than the Bamboos. So because of this, when you're riding it, it gives the perception or feel, in my opinion, as this deck is a little bit wider. It's why when you're riding it, aside from it being stiff, you feel very planted and stable while you're picking up speed on this board. Something else that you'll definitely notice is a drop down in the deck of the Carbon deck. It has almost like a little step. It sounds like a really silly way of explaining it, but you effectively have somewhere to position your foot at the front of the board that you can kind of push against and feels really nice. Same especially as the back of the board. While you're accelerating or getting ready to accelerate, having that kind of drop down in the deck, being able to position your foot on that drop down is almost like a little place to get some leverage from as you're about to take off, feels great. It's definitely something that I didn't think I was going to enjoy so much. I thought this would be the deck that I'd prefer out of the two options that Evolve have. But having ridden the Carbon deck, I'm quickly becoming a fan of it. Some other changes in the deck is also going to be the fact that with the Bamboo, you're able to adjust the positioning of the trucks. So if you want to have a tighter turning circle or radius rather, you're able to adjust the trucks, either moving them back or moving them forward based on what you'd prefer to do. And this isn't something that you can do on the Carbon. I'm not saying it's going to make a massive difference, but it's definitely nice to have those little adjustments that you can do on the Bamboo deck versus the Carbon deck. And last point about the deck, in terms of the thickness, with the Bamboo over here, because it has that battery enclosure, the battery isn't integrated into the deck like on the Carbon GTR. This board is roughly 60 millimeters in thickness, including the deck and the battery. Whereas when we look at the Carbon GTR, this one over here is 40 millimeters in thickness when we include the battery, which is integrated into the deck, and of course the deck itself. So you're looking at about 20 millimeters in thickness difference between these two boards. Now, when we touch on some of the other changes that both of these two boards have, it's a couple of little things that you don't really notice if you're just glancing at them quickly online or in a store. That's going to be the fact that the GTR Carbon doesn't have any USB ports on the board. So if you want to be able to have that on your board, if you're looking to attach, for example, like the LED strips that you can get, the lights for the Evolve boards, this is going to be a board that you can't really do that with. Now, when we look at the Bamboo, of course, that means that you've got two USB ports on here, so you can attach those types of accessories. And aside from that, the charger port and also the power button is on the sides of the board. It's not really a big deal. I would personally prefer them to be on the bottom or in the same position that you'll see that they are on the Carbon, but it's just food for thought. So you've got one side over here that has the charger port and the other side has the power button. Now, cleaning and maintenance aren't really something that maybe too many people would think about when you get a board. Definitely something that I think about. With the Bamboo, because of the flexible battery design that's been implemented here with those gaps or grooves in the batteries, it does make cleaning and maintaining the board a little bit more, I guess you could say, long-winded than it needs to be, because you have to kind of go through those grooves, go through those different sections of the battery enclosure to make sure that you get them clean going around the deck. Whereas when you look at the GTR Carbon, you can literally just give it one wipe at the bottom because everything's sealed. There's nothing on the bottom of the board but Carbon, and it's very, very easy to maintain and clean it up, which is something that I think about. Last point, and that's going to be the weight of these two boards. The Carbon GTR sits at 9.8 kilograms, whereas the Bamboo sits at 10.3 kilograms. That doesn't sound like a massive difference, but when you're carrying these two boards upstairs, in and out of a car, through doorways, constantly having to pick it up, you definitely do feel the difference in the weight. It's not something that's not manageable. I definitely suggest getting a backpack for these longboards if you're going to be jumping off and on trains, running upstairs. Definitely recommended because of the weight of either of these boards. But the lighter one for sure that you do notice is going to be the carbon. It's much, much easier to carry. And also because it's thinner, doesn't sound like a big one, but it's easier to pick up if you're going to be picking it up from the deck versus the very, very thick bamboo. As always, when I'm filming a video, there's construction outside my office, and this always happens. Bear with me, hopefully it's not too loud. But this brings us quickly to the end of the video. What have I learned from riding both of these two boards? Which one is my favorite? I've always gone for bamboo decks. Coming from riding boosted boards, I always wanted to have a deck that was flexible. And having ridden other boards that have stiff decks like hub motor boards, like the X-Ways, I wasn't too much of a fan of the stiff decks. I prefer having a flexible deck. But being honest, after having ridden this, I took to it a lot better than I thought I would, especially because of the drop down in the deck that makes you feel really planted when you're accelerating and going very, very quickly, the stability that it has. I didn't really feel like I was hindered in my carving because of the stiffer deck versus the bamboo. I'm not going to lie, and I will say that the bamboo does feel amazing to carve with because of the way that deck snaps back into place when you really lean into it and make it flex. It feels great, but at the same time, this still feels great and still feels stable. I think, knowing what I know now, if I was to go back to Wick's electric skateboard store in Hackney and I was going to be buying both of these boards again, I would probably pick up two carbon GTRs, which is a massive shock for me, just based off how much fun I had riding this board. But saying that, still a big fan of this board. I'm still going to keep this board. Whether I get a carbon in the near future is going to be an interesting one to see. I guess you guys will have to hold out and see. But hopefully I've helped you in trying to figure out the differences between these two boards. If there's anything that you feel like I've missed or anything that you feel like you want to ask me, leave your comments down below in the comment section and I'll get to them as quickly as I possibly can. But a big thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. Please consider subscribing and thumbs up if you haven't done so already. As a quick side note, the next video that I have coming out is going to be on these big boys over here. You can see that these massive 107s are already fitted to the carbon over here. I'm going to be putting these onto my bamboo and really seeing what these wheels can do. I'll create a comparison between the 97s and the 107s to give you some insight there. Of course, I'm also going to be doing the AT wheels versus the street wheels and also looking at the gearing options that the Evolve boards have, how much of a difference they really make and what's the difference between, you know, the 32 versus the 38, going into detail about that. So stay tuned, keep watching, keep subscribing and leave your comments down below and I'll catch you in the next one. Don't forget to follow on Instagram as well, guys. Take care.